I'd like to just go through and add my thanks to people here as well before I start. Certainly to the St. George's Foundation for having me get involved and also being here this weekend to give these talks. And in particular, Leandra, she was wonderful, great help to me over the last really year and a half about putting the type of research that I needed together and assisting me with this program this weekend. And of course also Sharon, who's I guess down turning up the heat, but she's been wonderful too since we've been here, and her husband Larry. It's really been a great pleasure to meet them. And also to the Sea Venture Trust, Jack Lightbourne, and I just met Steve Cook this evening, and I'm grateful for their funding, I guess, of these models. I think they're wonderful pieces, and certainly add to the continuity of the large Sea Venture model that is already here. My talk tonight is basically a casual one. I don't really read stuff. It's more conversational. We will have a question and answer period at the end, and I'd be happy to answer what I can. I think there are a lot of people here tonight that probably know a lot more than I do about the history of this, but nonetheless, I'm going to give you my take on what happened and how we sort of approached this project. It's basically in three parts. The first part is talking about a little bit about the story, the Sea Venture, the people that were involved. Then a fairly long segment, if you will, on the naval architecture of how we approach the design and building of these models. And then the last segment is just a little bit of explaining details on the models themselves, just sort of highlighting certain aspects that when you go look at them, you can check that out in particular. This guy here is a very important player in my mind. I had our artists at home build a little figure. This is Richard Frobisher, and we're not really sure what he looked like, but this was my sort of image of this guy, and I felt that he was a critical player in this whole episode and story. The flag, by the way, is a really unusual one, but she was flown on Susan Constant and Sea Venture. It's a British merchant ensign, but very attractive flag. All right, the story, as you all know, starts with Sea Venture, and she's coming over here. It's a relatively new ship. She probably really wouldn't have had sea trials that we would all think a vessel like this would have had before she took such a transatlantic trip. But we know certain details about her, and this is a very good reconstruction of what we think she looked like. In fact, the gunport grease was something we added to this model when we found a hot penny. I forget the date, maybe Jack would remember it, but it was very close to the settling, and it showed this gunport wreathed decor, which was again very typical. She, as we know the story goes, she's caught in this hurricane and manages through the great seamanship of Captain Christopher Newport and Admiral Summers, bring her through the storm, and they see this island and maneuver through the reefs and try to get this vessel as close as possible. This underwater diorama shows what remains of the Sea Venture wreck. It's basically floor timbers and sections of her keel. But what was very clever with these two naval officers was that they got it as close as they possibly could. And they lodged it, maybe intentionally, in this little V-shaped coral reef. And it's on an angle, you can see that it's really not all that deep. In fact, it's only about 30 feet to the deepest part. This would be the stern, that would be the bow. We have information on this construction of Sea Venture as well as Susan Constant. So we are again trying to put ourselves back in this era of shipbuilding and how these vessels sailed and what they carried. This is a model we did of Sea Venture for the Jamestown, Yorktown settlement. It's a very, I'm sorry, this is Sea Venture. This is a larger model that's out here. And the framing, the open framing here is partially of what's still left of her on the sea bottom off St. Catherine. We find that as the story goes, because she was relatively close to shore, they launched the ship's boat and then start to gather their supplies steadily off the ship, probably for several months. It's one of these things that if you were part of this passenger or crew, you realize that Sea Venture is not going to sail again, and you've got to take everything you possibly can off it. The Sea Venture wreck site, we believe, was again off St. Catherine here. This was an early map that George Cook provided me that Summers had actually drawn, very accurate. I know there's controversy as to just where the future rescue vessels were built, so I'm just going to give you some of my sort of thoughts on possibly what would be at least one likely spot. To me, the building bay location seems to be an ideal little cove to build a ship of some size and be able to launch it on an even grade. Plus, no doubt there would be plenty of cedar trees to cut and supply the building of. Apparently this was also called Frobisher's Building Bay. I guess that shows up in some of the commentary about this situation. But this is where I think, would be a likely spot for deliverance. This is a Google site. For those of you who haven't been out there maybe lately, you can see how this is just such a perfect little protective cove. And then, of course, Sea Venture is somewhere out here, so it would be very convenient to strip it and bring supplies in. This is Sea Venture sort of close-up details, but I think you can get an idea that there's an awful lot of material, both wood and what they could salvage, and blocks and tackle, rigging off this boat. And again, this is mostly was built out of oak. This would be prime material for shipbuilding, so they would want to get as much of this off of there as possible. Anchors, I think they salvaged 2 guns. The rest of them, I think they jettisoned during the hurricane. But this was a major artifact that they could really deal with. This is a model that we did for Jamestown. This is actually Susan Constant, but it just gives you an idea of what the interior might have looked like on Sea Venture. They were very similar vessels. They could hold lots of supplies, and again, this was sort of the third supply expedition to Jamestown, and they were taking as much stuff as they could. So she is well equipped with all sorts of gear and cargo. The people on board, to me, this was a fascinating thing. You've got an admiral, you've got a general, you've got a very experienced captain, you've got Richard Frobisher. He's an experienced shipwright. He actually worked on building Sea Venture. So here's a guy who really knows what he's doing or should be doing. You've got experienced sailors and crew. you've got miscellaneous people as carpenters, blacksmiths, farmers, women who could do various tasks and aid to building these vessels or dealing with sails, not only to just feed and supply the men as well. And then most of all, you've got these supplies. The carpentry, the tools were there. They were on board. You have these shipwrights. They're bringing their tools over to Jamestown because they think they're going to start building ships there. So here's this wonderful bounty of supplies that Sea Venture has. And what do they want to do? They want to get this stuff off that boat, because the only way they're going to get off this island is to build a rescue vessel, or two, as it turned out. So for us, this was an incredible element in terms of understanding who these people were and then how they could build these future vessels. As we all know, the story goes that Thomas Gates here worked closely with Frobisher to build Deliverance. Meanwhile, George Summers went on to deal with building the smaller vessel, Patience. To me, and I may be wrong, but I can't help believe that if you're Summers, you're an admiral, you know how to sail these vessels, you probably know a lot about their design and sailing qualities, but you're not a builder. You've never built one. So to avoid, dealing with or involving Frobisher, to me didn't make sense. You've got this guy who built Sea Venture, he knows the methods of the day, you would get him involved. We're not really sure where she was built. Some think it was quite a distance away, and others maybe not so far. But I doubt very much that Frobisher would have been out of the picture totally, because I don't think these guys could do it. Certainly an Army general probably couldn't do it. Because of the era and the need to build a sophisticated vessel that could sail from here to Jamestown, what they decided to build were pinnaces. And Frobisher probably did the design of these vessels. He was a shipwright. They really weren't that complicated designs, and they were proven in history. This is a definition of a pinnace, a lightly built vessel with a square stern, fitted with 3 masts, a very modest rig, and then sails. Not a whole lot of complexity there. Designing these rescue vessels employed very fundamental rules. This was all standardized information produced during this late 16th century, early 17th century, and it all evolved around this idea of proportions. Everything was proportional to everything else. And the interesting thing is, you talk about a vessel's tonnage. Well, if we know the tonnage of a vessel, like Sea Venture, you can figure and calculate out all these other 3, the length of the keel, the breadth, and the depth. Or if you don't know the tonnage, what we knew from Strachey, the length of the keel, the breadth, the depth, and his estimate of tonnage, this is all you need. Believe it or not, this is all you need to build a boat. There are 3 major references we refer to in this reconstruction process. The most influential one was Matthew Baker's. This was a major treatise on shipbuilding at the time, and pinnaces would have been included in this, as would something the size of Sea Venture. Harriet's work came a little bit later, but nonetheless we referenced that because we wanted to see if he had done research that would prove different from Baker. And then this Admiralty Library manuscript also lent confirmation to Baker's work, and so we decided to go with his formulas and reasoning on how to build these, which Frobisher would have known. Frobisher and Summers probably first did a basic scale drawing. They had paper, certainly, and they would maybe draw a little sketch of what they thought they would need in the way of a vessel to carry the passengers off, the cargo and supplies to make the trip. Again, it's imperative to have these three elements. The length of the keel, which is here. It stops here. It doesn't include this arc. They need the stern post. And then the stem. The stem is also just a calculation using a compass. These are all proportional. So if you drew this out and you say, well, gee, that's not quite enough of an arc, you could redraw it. You could always tweak these things and change them. But once you had this figured out and these dimensions, you had to pretty much stay with that because everything else worked off those dimensions. Everything. Mass, bars, you name it. But very, very fundamental. So with that in mind, we started to first look at deliverance and using the Baker theories and calculations. And here we have, right out here in St. George, the replica of deliverance. And I often ask Leandro, I said, well, where did that information come from? Who built that? You know, where did they get those ideas? Well, we know that Cyril Smith in Pageant back in the 1960s developed the plans for deliverance, and we got a hold of those, and we checked them against our theory that Baker was the guy. Well, it turns out that Cyril Smith used Baker's concepts to a T. They were perfect. So now we knew that Smith was right on. He was in conjunction with us about how to approach the building of these and how to do our lines drawings. Our lines drawings, which I'm sorry are a little faded in this view, show some changes that we did to deliverance. Very minor, and I'll go into those later. And then we did our rendition of what we thought patients would look like based on the information that Strachey provided us with the dimensions. Here's deliverance. These are, again, very, very fundamental calculations, but they show you these percentages and how everything relates to another. But again, the length of the keel is a must. The beam, and this was pretty much on the inside of the hull. And then the depth of the hull. You have this arc for the radius. All these vessels at the time were very sort of bluff bow, very heavy forward. They had the square stern. The stern post is here. This was a measurement based off of this calculation. And then the overall length on deck was critical. Now these lines drawings gave us the ability, once we believed in them, to actually build a hull. We could build a real vessel from this if you wanted to. Here's deliverance, the model sort of put up against our profile lines drawing that we came up with, which was also basically verified by Cyril Smith. And two of the things we changed were the angle here. We didn't feel it had to be broken in two levels, like on the replica. We made it a little lower than what's on the replica. And also the forecastle, this little feature up here, we lowered that. We felt that that could not be quite as high according to Strachey's records. He indicated that it was almost like a crawl space. It was a place to go for protection. And whereas on the replica, when you look at that, or you look at Cyril Smith's plan, this is higher. You know, a 6-foot man could walk in that door. very easily and stand up and walk around in there. And I think he did it because he knew tourists were going to go on board and it was a safety issue, and makes perfect sense. But otherwise, everything else he's done or did worked out fine. So we made very little modification to this plan. Here's some close-up views of the model, the bow, just like the replica. We added here, this is Bermuda cedar planking, but we knew that during the construction of Deliverance, because they had stripped off as much as they possibly could off Sea Venture, that they used oak a lot on the structural building of Deliverance, but then also on some features like this. This is the beakhead and the forecastle, which in a heavy sea would take a real pounding, so you want something very strong up there. And so we felt that probably the last bit of oak would have been used in that location. Here, this square stern and rudder. Now on the Patience, this was sort of the unknown, design. What did this thing look like? There are lots of ideas, but we referred to this guy, William Baker, who was the resident expert on colonial shipbuilding at MIT. He wrote several books about colonial shipbuilding, was very influential with Cyril Smith building the replica here, building the Susan Constant, very knowledgeable guy. Anyway, Bill died several years ago, but his protege, Eric Romberg, knew a lot about this era, and he said, Michael, I think what you'd want to have is a small pinnace, but you'd want to have some protection for the helmsman. And we agreed with that because here these guys just came out of a hurricane. It's the last thing they want to run into again. And why not protect the helmsman on this small boat? So we decided to go with this general feature, and the date of this drawing by this Lucas Wagoner was certainly of the right era. So we knew these vessels existed. Here's our line drawing of Patience. Again, these various aspects that we needed to include. The radius, here's her beam. All of this is very easily calculated. It wasn't rocket science at all. It was done with compasses and battens to be drawn out in almost full dimensions. Here we added the aft, what I call the aft cuddy, to protect the helmsman, and otherwise it's a very straightforward pinnace design. Here's the model shown against the profile of the Patience drawing. The cabin here we felt had to have just enough headroom for maybe 2 or 3 people to be in there and operate the tiller. This was a tiller steerage. You'll also note that on her, she doesn't have a lot of freeboard. The waterway here is open to allow water to rush right out as fast as it came in. And also her planking on the bulwarks is open. There was no caulking here. It was basically a gap of maybe 1 or 2 inches in scale between the planks. Here's some close-ups of the model, the square stern feature, the cuddy. Here you can see the open bulwark planking and the waterway. Very necessary, we felt, for a vessel of this type. We also, during the course of this reconstruction, contacted Jamestown because they had just built their 2 replicas again, Godspeed and Discovery. And they had also done a major state-funded research program in England to back up their designs based on their dimensions. And They were extremely helpful to us. Eric Speth, the curator there, I ran both our plans by him to see if these were making sense and were in keeping with their research, and he said absolutely. On the ships, or the vessel's construction, as many of you know, probably that the cedar during this era, there were stands of maybe 70, 80, 90 feet high. Very, very, significant trees that could be cut. What shipbuilders would do, they would select certain trees, not only for their length of a plank, let's say for a keel, but also for their shapes, because they would use shapes like this for interior structures. There would be knees to support the decks. And so all of this would have been figured out before they cut the tree, just what they would yield from these stands, and they would need to cut a lot. The other element that was significant, and they had it on board Sea Venture, were these tools. They had shipwright tools, caulking tools, but the most significant one is really the adze. The adze was the tool. It could shape, it could cut, it could, it could make a spar, it could make a flat plank. It was an awesome tool if you knew how to use it. Plus, again, her passengers and crew, we had carpenters, guys who could build stuff. So all this stuff was right there. They had everything. And really just a miracle, in my opinion, that all this stuff existed. This might be what it would look like once the trees were taken down and pieces cut from them. The adze would have been used to really fine-tune them. And this all would have been laid out in a careful order. They would have built just a big deck, frankly, to start the laying of the keel. They would put the keel down on this, which is basically here, and everything would be built up and framed right from that. Again, to me, the building bay that I talked about, it seemed like a likely spot because the grade there was very low. When you built a significant ship, you think of the replica here, you've got to get that thing down into the water. So you want to be as close to it as you can, but also protected. I mentioned this word tree nails. These were, they didn't have any iron at this time to really fasten these frames together, so they made basically pegs, and the pegs were, they would drill through and then hammer in the pegs to secure the frames. This is a very simplistic view of how it would start. Basically, the keel was put down, the stern post, a little deadwood here to hold it in shape. Then the stem would be figured out. And then they would possibly work on the midship frame or the beam, which was really a little bit forward than a midship in terms of naval architecture during this era. But this is really the beginning. And as you can see, it's not crazy, naval architecture. Here's again the platform. This is actually the stern post. They're working from the stern forward, and they're raising one of the frames. This is actually a photo of what took place at Jamestown when they were building their replicas there originally. But again, this could all be done. You've got material, you've got block and tackle, you've got carpenters, you've got people who know how to do this stuff. This could all be done. It wasn't, gee, what are we going to do? Here's a little progression of how the framing would, move forward. Again, the stern is back here, and they're building these frames, hoisting them up, moving it forward to the stem. They would start tying them together with these stringers. There would be stringers on the outside and inside. And then, of course, they would start doing some fundamental deck features to, again, support these frames as they're going up. These were, keep in mind, very lightly built vessels. We're not even sure if they were double sawn frames. Certainly not the patient's. She was probably just a single sawn frame, whereas Deliverance might have been a bit heavier. Just sort of another skeletal view of what it might look like. Here's some stringer planks and the stern, the keel, and then the various frames. Here all this terminology is wonderful. Again, Frobisher, Gates, Summers, all the crew, Newport, all would have known this stuff, and it would have been just all making sense to them. One of the features I talked about earlier was the forecastle. Here's some framing here. This is probably a lot more framing that was on Deliverance, but it shows what was involved. And then her planking. We, as I mentioned, did lower the height of this thing to make it a little more in keeping with the written record. The last segment is on the models. We kept the same scale as the large model of Sea Venture. So these are all to the same scale. So when you look at little patients out there, keep in mind, this is the same scale as the big Sea Venture, and it's quite a difference. We used Bermuda cedar for the topside planking on both of them, and then we used a sort of a tallow cream color kind of paint to show the bottom. Historically, the paintwork on Sea Venture would have been a tallow cream color base paint that was tallow and other chemicals mixed into this mess, and then they would put it on the hull. And it was used to basically prevent worms from boring through the planking and creating leaks and damage and rot to the hull. Well, here Deliverance and Patience didn't have that stuff. It's one of the things they didn't bring with them because they thought they could probably make it once they got to Jamestown because it was mostly tar-based. But they still wanted to do something to protect these hulls. And according to the written documents, they actually got limestone, whelk shells, which are like little periwinkles. They crushed all this stuff up. They caught sea turtles, they boiled the sea turtles, created this oil from the turtle shells, and then they mixed this all together into this concoction and painted that on the bottom. So they were again in keeping with the tradition of protecting this whole bottom. And the color probably was a yellowy color like this, maybe a little more greenish. We don't really know. We did ask a chemist about what it might have looked like, and he thought it was probably more of a slimy green than yellow, but we thought the yellow was a little more attractive for the models. It's one of these things, who could say? Here's some construction process of the Deliverance. It's basically a block hull. We did not build them framed like the real ship, but these are laminated layers of wood, basswood, some structural supports put in on her, and again planked over with Bermuda cedar. This was before we put a finish on it, but they were quite attractive vessels. Here's Deliverance, and I had my little guy Frobisher. I was expecting to give this talk also to some kids, and I thought this would be a great element to show them some sense of scale. How big is a human on board this, or how small he might be. Here he is standing next to the capstan, a design feature that we know. This was something Sea Venture had. They might have taken the top portion of Sea Venture's off. We don't really know, but quite possibly. We know that they cut her mast down and took all that ashore. This is a wooden log pump that would, get the water out of the bottom of the bilge. And then this image here is important because, again, it goes back to this height issue. Frobisher may have been, 5'8" in terms of height, but he's obviously taller than entering this forecastle, as is the railing around the top of it. I think on the replica it might be waist high, whereas we felt that was more timber and they're in a hurry. Not a lot of people are going to go up here except the sailors, so we made it knee high, just to reduce the weight of this thing. Close-up details on the patients and her construction. Here is the block hull. It's planked over again in cedar, and then the aft cuddy was built up separately on top of the deck for that. Again, we added Frobisher here to show how big a man would be. Not a lot of room on this boat. And this little protection area was, I think, critical and probably well used by these guys in their sail to Jamestown. Another feature that we did with her was her rig, which I mentioned earlier, that basically showed the aft cuddy. But on a bark rig pinnace, you need to have 3 masts. And as with Deliverance, we added this feature of a small lateen mast, so a lateen yard and a mast here, a mizzen mast with a lateen sail. This was a very useful sail to help steerage. It's like a fore and aft sail. Very, very common in this era. And it would have made this boat far more steady sailing on her voyage. And as we know, she not only went to Jamestown, but she came back to Bermuda and then went back to England and sailed in England for several years. So she was a very seaworthy little vessel. Just quickly, these are some of the other references we utilized in the reconstruction of our models and of the thinking that we put together. All very helpful and all pretty much incorporated into the models. And that's my presentation. I'd be happy to take some questions. Yes.
Michael, thank you. A great presentation. You mentioned with the patients you didn't think they used any caulking on the deck. So wouldn't that have meant a lot of water going below and a lot of pumping?
It was not, I didn't really say that precisely. It was her bulwarks that they didn't caulk. You can see light coming through there. Okay. And here, they didn't butt them tight like you'd think. They were open. They wanted the water to go out as quickly as it came in. They did use caulking. They had caulking tools. They had hemp that was on board Sea Venture, so they had these supplies. So yes, the decks would have been caulked, as would have been the hull, and then this coat of paint put on it. Yes.
What about the ballast for these vessels? Was it seemed to be necessary a great deal of ballast, or where would they have gotten it? And how would they?
Right.
Would they have recovered any from the Sea Venture at all? That's not what.
Probably unlikely from Sea Venture to get that kind of stuff out. But there was plenty of stone to cut, and someone else mentioned last night maybe sand. Sand was there. It would be a little bit harder to control sand and also placing it, whereas I think it was probably cut stone that they put in. Certainly Deliverance needed ballast, and they did do that right away.
And they did find some Bermuda stone in the foundations of the governor's house in the fort.
Did they? Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
I have no idea.
Okay, sorry.
I think I heard you say that Frobisher was involved with building Sea Venture.
That's right.
Do that.
Is
We
that a
know
quick?
very little about how Sea Venture was Well,
Yeah, she was built on a shipyard, I think just north of the estuary into the Thames River, and the story goes, from what I could understand, that she was very new, and possibly the oak that they used to build her was very new, and not necessarily seasoned like it possibly could have been. And then, of course, during the hurricane, they felt that the pounding she took, she was just racking and, just taking a beating, that possibly some of the caulking had come out, therefore causing leaks, and one thing led to another. So it was possibly not a fault of Frobisher's building, but possibly more circumstances of the materials, and then, of course, the condition.
so he was known to have built ships in that.
Oh, yes, yes.
In that yard or whatever it's called.
He worked on Sea Venture. Yeah. Yes.
Just to answer one of the earlier questions, I was just in Jamestown, and Bly Stroud, who's their head lab technician, gave me a piece of the limestone, which is Bermuda limestone. They've identified it, and they found it in the foundations of Delaware's buildings,
Yes.
and he arrived in 1610, so they know that limestone was there in 1610.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
And I've got a piece of it, and I'm going to give it to George.
Oh, great. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
And that was probably used as ballast.
Yes. Yeah. Very interesting. Yes.
I was with them in Jamestown, and I believe that, I'm not sure which the names were, but it might have been the Discovery. It was one of the smaller of the three, the smallest of the three.
That's right.
And it said that they used it in Virginia, and it didn't return across the ocean to England, and they thought that that was because of the small size. But it wasn't a seaworthy, so I'm surprised that the patients went back and forth.
Well, the Discovery was not it was a little bigger than Patience, but her rig was different. She was not a bark-rigged pinnace, and you need something like this rig to really do any offshore kind of sailing, and that was very critical in their thinking of what this rig was going to be, knowing where they had to go. But she couldn't make a trip like that.
So they're described as pinnaces, but the bark rig makes it different.
Yes. Yeah. The rigs would lend themselves to different sea travel conditions. Yeah.
How many people could travel on that piece? Crew, is it total number?
I don't know if there's any. Maybe George knows what the passenger numbers were on board Patience. I didn't come across anything. Yeah. I would think maybe 30 to 40 might be jammed on there. Not much more than that.
Which means 110 on the canoe.
Yeah. Pretty crowded. Yes. Yeah.
The standing rig, the running rig, and the sails were all salvaged from the Sea Venture for 2 ships?
Yeah, we believe that was very doable, and I think, with Patience being that much smaller, than Deliverance, they probably, may have used some of the spars off Sea Venture for her masts, or 1 or 2 of her masts, but with the adds, they could build their own spars. So my suspicion is Deliverance really got the best of the Sea Venture. She was the bigger boat, she needed to be heavier and more fortified. But yeah, the materials were there. The rigging material, they always had extra. It wasn't just what you saw. It was always supplies of that.
Like you had indicated last night that in your research, when Sea Venture logged up against the reef, she didn't sink, at least not right away, so they had ample time to go out and do the salvage work. Is that correct?
That's right. I think, when you think back to that original diorama, that was sort of the beauty of the circumstance, as bad as it was, that it lodged in this little coral reef. It couldn't really go down 100 feet. It was there, 30 feet down. Much of it, probably out of water, so they could come back, ferry back and forth with the longboat. They probably had little barges made. And if I were them, and I think if you were them, you'd take everything you possibly could off that boat. Whether you'd use it or not, you'd take it. Yes.
The wharf or the cradle that they actually built the ship on, was that way up on dry land, or would that be partially in the water?
I'm not sure the tide situation in Bermuda. I know, I would say they would probably do it as close to the water as possible.
I say that because Strachey recounts that the northern gales in Bermuda almost destroyed the Deliverance, and they had to actually build a bulwark in front of it to protect it.
To protect it, did they? Yeah.
So it suggests to me that it was partially in the water, but I'm not sure.
They probably didn't know the tide situation at that point, or to know about those storms, those incoming storms, to maybe change that. But a boat this big, like Deliverance, you would want to be as close as you could.
And how would they actually move the boat? I mean, they had 30 or 40 tons.
Yeah.
How would they get it? I guess it's chalk, and they take the chalk out.
Yeah, there was some, kind of slipway theory, but they also would use block and tackle to pull it down, and waiting for the highest tide, certainly. And they may have inched it down as they built it, getting it closer and closer. George?
More a comment, the question about how many people might have been aboard Patience. I think probably your figure, you said about 30, is probably about right. If only because some Sea Venture was towing a ship called a ketch, nameless, and it's come down the history to us as catch. She was cut loose during a storm, and she carried 30 people. And she probably was even smaller.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's in that region.
Yes, that would make sense. Yeah. It was obviously a very successful design and built well enough to survive so long. What I didn't find out was whatever happened to Deliverance. Here was supposedly the bigger vessel. Do we know?
I don't
Yeah.
know. I'd love to think she went back across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
Like this. I mean, it's amazing, this ship.
Yeah, exactly.
But when Patience got back to Lyme Regis, we know
Yes.
nothing.
Yes.
She did, yeah.
Yes, but beyond that, we know nothing.
Well, I think we know that she was there sailing that coast in some type of trade for several years. And people marveled at it. I think of the Deliverance replica before they sort of stained it or put the paint on it to preserve it. But, it would have looked that silvery gray. It was probably very unique to the English, especially around Lyme Regis, because they would have been all oak-built vessels in England. So to see this silvery thing coming along must have been quite interesting. Yes.
Michael, the decision to build two ships and the size of them, would that have all been based on the practicalities of getting them into the water and the location?
That's a good question. I thought about that. It was almost like Patience was an afterthought. Let's start with Deliverance, and somewhere along the line did they say, this isn't going to hold everybody or all our stuff that we really need to take with us. I don't know if Strachey or anyone else made reference to just when the second design was put forth. Probably fairly soon because of the building plan. But I don't know. Frobisher must have been involved with both of them really simultaneously.
And the Patience did have a carpenter with him. I think his name's Bennett. So he would probably have been an experienced carpenter. The other thing I just wanted to mention, I have a theory, which will take too long to develop right now. But I think the Patience was actually built in Bailey's Bay.
Okay.
I have reasons for
I've
that.
heard that before.
It would take me too long.
Yeah. Yeah, yes.
I'm sure you're aware that the Junior League in Bermuda built the Deliverance replica here in Orleans Island.
Right.
And I used to be very involved with it many years ago, before it was sold to Argo, which was a tour boat company. And then, of course, you know, the St. George's Foundation has rescued it and
Right.
taken it over. But we used to treat it with linseed oil and cuprinol,
Yeah.
and it was never painted, you know, with a stain. It was always that grayish look.
Yes, yeah.
And it was re-rigged, I'd say, once during the, it was opened in 1968. The keel was laid in 1965.
Yes.
And it was re-rigged once between that and probably the 90s.
That's right. We found records actually through Bill Baker at MIT, who consulted with the group at the time. He was indicating that he had found more research on the rig and how they would have done it, and he was advising the group to make these alterations to really bring it back up to authenticity. So,
Well, a lot of money was made, and it went back into the community in the Junior League by operating the
Right.
Deliverance, and we used to dress in costume and serve lemonade and banana bread and give tours.
yeah, right. Huh. Yeah, well, it's a great thing to have here, and you know, it's such a great story, and I just marvel at the people involved that did this, and then their afterlife as well. You know, some came back and others went on, and clearly there was a point where a lot of people didn't want to leave Bermuda. It's like, why are we leaving this? You know, go to Jamestown? And, you know, and I'm sure Gates said, "Huh, you're leaving. You know, this is the way we're going." And so, very unique story, and really, you know, human ingenuity, and yet to me, these guys had all the stuff. They had the knowledge, the wherewithal, the tools, the supplies to really pull this off. So it's a great story. Thank you.